Hello, everyone, and welcome to SDGC After Hours. And today, special, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy, one of my favorite series in the entire planet. But there's a catch. We're not going to just talk about Final Fantasy 1. We're not going to talk about Final Fantasy 2. We're definitely not just going to talk about Final Fantasy 12 because that's the worst game in the entire series. What we're going to
already
do
off to a bad start.
That's hyperbole on my part.
John hosts this. He can't be the intro.
That's hyperbole. That's hyperbole on my part. I admit it. But what we are going to do here is myself, Derek, and Finn from SDGC are going to go through every single Final Fantasy game and give our thoughts on how the series has evolved as a whole, 1 through 15. And let's lay down some ground rules. 1, we're only talking about the core series here, games 1 through 15. Unfortunately, as good as they are, games like Final Fantasy Chronicles and Final Fantasy Tactics are excluded, although we may tackle those at a later date. Second,
are we dealing with sequels too?
That was going to be my.
That's a good question.
That was going to be my next point. No, we are not, because I do not consider them to be core.
So we aren't going to deal with. So I think it depends on how important it is. Like I think, the after years for Final Fantasy IV is basically meaningless. It might as well not exist. But then 10-2, it's kind of hard not to talk about.
10-2 is great. Then you've also got Final Fantasy 12 Revenant Wings. Final Fantasy 13-2, Lightning Returns. But we can focus on those on a different video series. I think
it would be best. Final Fantasy spinoff.
No spinoffs. Core series.
Saying the next series could be.
Yeah.
I gotcha. Well,
season 2.
Why don't we go ahead and kick things off with Final Fantasy 1? And when I say Final Fantasy 1, I think it's best that we focus on the Dawn of Souls remake. Because there's more content. It's a perfect mix of what made the original Final Fantasy on NES so great while bringing it into the modern era. And so with that, we'll go ahead and kick off the discussion. I'm not going to sit here and rank Final Fantasy 1. What I will say is that as a beginning as a kind of a beginning for the series, it's interesting for fans who started with 7, I think 7 or 8 or 9, to go back and see how. Obviously Final Fantasy 1 has its strengths and weaknesses, and you know what? We'll focus on the weaknesses first. Obviously, very simple story. Very simple story in Final Fantasy 1.
Very simple, but see, I think that the actual hook of it, even though I think it's executed on very simply due to the time, but I think the concept of it is one of the stronger ones in the series. I mean, I think a lot of the later games end up having far more stupid and convoluted final villains and general plot twists, and there's something nice about the simplicity of the time loop at the end of Final Fantasy 1.
There's also, you have to remember, at the time when it released, it wasn't a simple story.
Yeah.
It was kind of unheard of in its complexity, I guess, as you could say it. I mean, maybe D&D style campaigns had more intricate stories, but before we only had Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest, the early ones, and those had less of a focus on story.
Yeah. Now, which of the Dragon Quest games were out before? That's going to come up on the screen. Which of the Dragon Quest games came out before Final Fantasy 1 did? I'm curious. I'm going to look that up.
Quest 1. Go ahead and look it up.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk about the villain, Garland? I think that's a great point of discussion for each one of these games, because a large part of Final Fantasy games are factored around, not just the heroes, but the villain as well. A great RPG villain lends weight and import to a story. So let's talk about Garland for a minute. Of course, Garland, the Dark Knight of Cornelia, who was the very first boss you fought in the game and ended up being the very last boss you fought in the game in the form of Chaos. Now, I thought there was a really interesting twist for Garland in that he wound up being... Okay, so it was 1 and 2 released before Final Fantasy 1.
Yep, that's what I literally just found it. God damn you, John.
Garland had a really interesting story arc. Now he wasn't the most complex villain. He didn't have the most complex motivations. But my first experience
Finn.
Experience with Final Fantasy was on the NES. And so when I found out that Garland, the knight I'd killed at the very beginning of the game, was stuck in a time loop and became Chaos, or was turned into Chaos by the Four Fiends at the very end of the game, creating a kind of a circle of time. I was 7 years old at the time, and that really blew my mind. But having replayed the Dawn of Souls version, going back and replaying it lessens his impact a little bit simply because he is such a one-note character.
Yeah, well, he shows up once very early in the game. He's like your first boss. You completely forget about him, and then he pops up again at the very end. And that's kind of cool when you remember and you're like, oh my god, it's that random dude from the beginning. And again, like understanding the limitations of how we had been telling stories in video games at the time. But I think it's cool. I think Garland ultimately, like, I love Garland now, and I think I owe a lot of that more to Dissidia than I do to the original Final Fantasy. Just
no, that's fair.
I mean, that's a low bar though, because I mean, Garland got almost next to no characterization at all in Final Fantasy 1, and he began a trend for Final Fantasy villains that, of course, wasn't as pronounced in subsequent games, but it was also something that you saw up until really around the time of Final Fantasy 6. Was the villain really wasn't that prominent. He would show up a couple times throughout the game to menace the heroes. And then he would dip out, and you wouldn't see him again for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I think
you
Final
didn't have
Fantasy,
that personal villain connection that you had in like 4 onward.
Well, in Final Fantasy, even more so than 4. I mean, not to get too down the rabbit hole in a different Final Fantasy game, but you didn't even meet Zemus until the very end of the game.
Well, that's a separate issue, unfortunately. The whole Final Fantasy games love to do that, where they
the giant space flea from nowhere.
Yeah,
the guy that you thought was the villain, it wasn't, because 9 did it, 4 did it. Those are the two big ones that really.
I mean, in a certain way, 1 did it. Like, you didn't even know there was a villain until suddenly the very, very end. And I mean,
literally the very end
a character you'd met before, but ultimately, like, it's only separated by the fact that you had technically met Chaos before at the very beginning of the game in a relatively minor encounter. So,
and actually, that's part of Garland's problem, is that everyone knows, or most people know, the final villain is Chaos, and the fact that he's Garland is quite frequently often forgotten.
Yeah,
and that's how unremarkable he was as the antagonist. Everyone remembers the 4 Fiends.
Yeah, I was going to say the 4 Fiends kind of add to a lot of the flavor of, because Final Fantasy 1 doesn't have super memorable bosses outside of the 4 Fiends, mostly because a lot of them.
There's Garland, there's the vampire. I can't really
There's
remember.
Warmech.
Yeah, Warmech. Oh, dude, the Warmech is so great though, as the first like mini super boss kind of.
The first super boss. So let me ask you guys this: like, obviously, Final Fantasy 1 began a lot of the trends that became ubiquitous throughout the series, whether you're talking about active time battle, or some of them, like imps and goblins, made their first appearance in Final Fantasy 1. So did airships. Of course, we didn't have chocobos or Moogles until Final Fantasy 3, I believe, or Cid until Final Fantasy 2. Yeah. Cid of the Lufane for Final Fantasy 2, but. If weighing it against modern Final Fantasy titles, which I think is fair, because Final Fantasy, they say you shouldn't judge games of the past measured up against games of today, but I still maintain that Final Fantasy 6 is better than almost any Final Fantasy game that has been released since. So
as a whole package, yeah.
I think it's entirely fair to measure this against the rest of the series. So when I'm not straying away from numbered rankings, when we're talking about the upper tier, the mid tier, or the lower tier, where does this fall in the Final Fantasy pantheon?
I think it depends on which version you're talking about. Because like you said, bringing up Dawn of Souls is the best version by far.
But for me, the definitive version was the PSP version, which took the Dawn of Souls and then updated it to look even better.
PSP didn't have the Dawn of Souls content.
No, that was you're thinking of Final Fantasy 4.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, but. Because that's the thing, is like, and if I could have the Dawn of Souls game looking like the PSP remake, would have been, but we're not so lucky.
Isn't it such a shame that the Game Boy Advance got definitive versions of so many Final Fantasies? Because the Final Fantasy
not
6
if you own a Game Boy Advance.
Man.
But I think the original game, like, let's talk about the original versus the best version, right? The original game, classic though it is, it's buggy as hell. There's several intended mechanics and spells that don't even work or work against how they were intended to work. There are entire classes that are either completely overpowered or almost worthless on your team. I mean, like the thief was useless, right? And yeah.
Also, let's not forget about the greatest spell in the entire series, Amut.
Yeah,
I know it's Amut, but I pronounce it Amut because there's no E.
Amut.
A spell that protects you, that keeps you from getting silenced. It's just the most pointless thing in the world, right?
Great, guys. Like, but I think the original is rough. I mean, it's very, very bottom of the series. I think Dawn of Souls for me is maybe like a low mid. Like the lack of more modern story elements kind of holds it back compared to a lot of the franchise. But I think it's very playable if you can get past the fact that it's kind of a little bit more simple and like exploration driven than objective driven, you know?
Finn, would you agree with that?
I would. I would rank it in the middle to low tier.
Yeah.
Like, it's not bottom of the barrel, but it's not much higher. And it's because that even though it set the standard and set a lot of the things that we associate Final Fantasy with, the four fiends, crystals, various items, spells, and monsters.
It was also the first appearance of the main Final Fantasy theme.
That is true. The crystal theme. Everyone loves the crystal theme.
The prelude. Let's call it by its proper name. Please continue.
It's hard to go back without the nostalgia visor.
Yeah.
Even with the Dawn of Souls extra-ness, it is an unforgiving game. And during the NES era, that was par for the course. But the RPG genre has evolved, and going back to its roots sometimes is a little rough.
Yeah.
And that's the crux of the matter, is that, my favorite Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy is my favorite series of all time. There are some Final Fantasy games I go back and I play constantly. 6, 7, 4. And then there are games that I don't ever want to touch again, like Final Fantasy 1. It was great for what it was. I love the Dawn of Souls remake, but I don't feel I'm not compelled whatsoever to go back and experience that again, because I've seen what it has to offer, and I would define it as just fine.
Like, we can appreciate what it's done. We can respect the fact that it existed, but we don't have to put it on a pedestal it doesn't deserve.
Yeah. I secretly... However, you go first.
No, I was saying, John said start with the weaknesses, but I feel like we haven't talked about what made the game so good yet.
Well, I mean, we kind of did, because like I said, it's fairly unique plot for its time. The twist with Garland being Chaos being one of the better ones. The Fiends are fantastic, memorable bosses.
I have some more to say about it.
Oh, then keep going. Keep it going.
I mean, the fact that you could choose your team and customize it to your specifications. The fact that, at least with the spells and the magic system, it allowed a degree of complexity in battle that before that hadn't really existed in an RPG from Japan. Because again, at the time, you have to compare it to Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior for us Americans. And it had magic, it had party members and stuff, but it wasn't the same level of uniqueness or diversity.
Yeah,
it didn't give you as many options. And I remember debating with friends what team was the best. Like, everyone insisted. I was a purist. You had to have a fighter, you had to have a thief, you had to have a black mage, and you had to have a white mage, because you got to have that ninja.
Yeah,
and the ninja was broken. But there was some people that insisted red mage was worthwhile, and I still never feel. I was like, but you don't get the ultimate spells, and you have so many restrictions, and
they're like an early game broken, early mid game they're so broken, but later on they're crippled by lack of growth. So,
and there was just so many parts of it that still stick with me, even though if I can't remember the particulars, like the Giant's Cave, or going into the volcano, or raising the airship for the first time from the desert. Stumbling on a war mech when none of my friends had, and they thought I was lying about fighting a giant robot on a bridge.
It does sound like some lying bullshit that a kid would make
right?
up.
Like right up there with all the other pre-internet lies you would tell people about video games.
My uncle works at Nintendo.
Shao Kahn.
Well, I think we'll go ahead and we'll cut it off here. We're trying to keep these to 10-15 minutes. But
can I give one more huge positive for me?
Very well, Derek. Very well.
Thank you.
Only because I allow it.
Final Fantasy started a trend. I mean, the whole genre, fantastic soundtrack to most games, but I feel like Final Fantasy 1 to me has, of all the early games, say 1, 2, and 3, the most memorable and the best overall soundtrack. I mean, the battle theme, the overworld theme, introducing the prelude in the main theme, Matoya's Cave, Mount Gulug. I mean, you're talking about like just a ton of beautiful, beautiful tracks. The only weird thing is, correct me if I'm wrong, the original Final Fantasy didn't have a boss theme of any kind, right?
It did not.
It's just the one battle theme.
Not even Chaos.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to fight Chaos and just have the
regular battle. Yeah.
I'm gonna say one quick thing I forgot. I'm so sorry, John.
After this, we have to end it.
This game has to be given credit for, especially compared to Dragon Quest, is the ease of use it allowed. Dragon Quest games at the time, you had to like select stairs, you had to select door, you had to select talk.
Bad.
There was something so revolutionary and yet so like, how did this take so long to just press a button or walk onto the stairs or walk into a door, and it worked.
That's really true. That's a good point. Well, we'll go ahead and we will agree to end the Final Fantasy talk here. Please tune in for our next episode here on SDGC After Hours, where we will discuss Final Fantasy II.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. There's a reason it didn't come to America for a while.
All right. We'll see you next time.